Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the South-South Dialogue on Sustainability. My name is Sitoy Jadi Margaret from Southwest University and Global University for Sustainability. We provide Portuguese, English, and Chinese simultaneous interpretation. You can find a group icon of interpretation at the bottom of your computer screen. We would like to thank the interpreters, Julia Ruz Di Giovanni, Melina Hervada, Huang Xiaomei, and Li Monghong. Apart from Zoom webinar, we also do live streaming on Bilibili, which is a very popular social media platform in China. There are thousands of young followers who are interested in world politics and eager to learn alternative thoughts and experience. In the past 3 years, we organized 3 lecture series: Venezuela in Struggles, Colonial Past, Revolutionary Legacy, and Community Regeneration. The second one, Experience with Indigenous Communities in Chiapas, Cosmovision and Sustainability. The third one, African Peoples' Struggles for Liberation. All videos are recorded and uploaded to the website of Global University. And now we are organizing the 4th lecture series of Constructing Alternative Paradigms in Brazil. The series is co-organized by Global University for Sustainability, CCRD-CS Lingnan University, PPGPS Federal University of Espírito Santo, Institute for Rural Revitalization Strategy, Southwest University, and Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives. This lecture series by Brazilian scholars and activists will explore the construction of alternative paradigms in Brazil and Latin America. The topics include Brazilian political economy, liberation theology, participatory budgeting, liberation pedagogy, food sovereignty, agroecology, climate justice, rainforest alliance, community currency, Latin America integration, among others. On 13 December in 2022, we had the first lecture, Paradigms of Food Sovereignty and Agroecology in Brazil, by João Pedro Dil, who is the leader of Brazil Land Workers Movement and a representative of the Floresta Fernandes National School in Brazil. Tonight, we will have lecture 2, Brazil in the World Economy, and the urgent need for constructing a new paradigm. We are very glad to invite 3 speakers to discuss about the current dilemma and possibilities in Brazil after Lula victory. The first speaker is Paulo Nakatani. He is professor at the Department of Economics and Postgraduate Program in Social Policy, Federal University of Espírito Santo in Victoria, Brazil. He has been president of the Brazilian Society of Political Economy and director of its academic review. He is member of the Latin American Society of Political Economy and of the International Crisis Observatory. Since 2011, from China, our research team has closely collaborated with a research team in Brazil when we initiate a comparative studies of 7 emerging countries, E7, which include Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey, and Venezuela. The 7 countries were chosen because they were at the time portrayed by mainstream media as moving from the periphery to the core. Scholar activists from the 7 countries set up national research teams. Professor Paulo Nakatani was leader of the Brazilian research team with core members including Professor Rogério Ferreira. The first phase of comparative studies ended in 2012 with a report and an academic conference in Beijing. The research output of the second phase was a book, Globalization and National Competitions, a comparative study of 7 emerging countries, published in Chinese in January 2021. Over 210,000 copies were sold in the last 2 years. This is an indication of the interest among Chinese readership in an intellectual position that interrogates neoliberalism and capitalism and assume a position for the subaltern and the global south. The cooperation amongst E7 research teams, particularly between Brazilian and Chinese researchers, has continued in the last 10 years, not only in producing research output, but also in exchange programs, such as a series of field trips in Brazil and China, visiting scholar programs, Cape Spring research projects, and social forums on sustainability starting from 2011. Based largely on a Marxist critique of colonialism and financial capitalism, we endeavor to explore alternative thoughts and theorize practice on the ground. Now I would like to invite Professor Nakatani to make his presentation on the issue of debt and the dependency of the Brazilian economy. Thank you.
Eu queria iniciar agradecendo pelo convite.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'd like to say it is a pleasure to be here with you today, together with Rogério, Rosa, Jadi. So our topic today is debt and dependence in Brazil. This is an old issue. And we must say that Brazil was dependent as of the onset. And for over 300 years, it was a dependent colony through slave work producing goods for the capitalist center. So the dependence is an old issue, a long-standing issue, but despite of the political independence, the economic dependence remained. The debt is also very old. We attained independence in 1822, but Brazil inherited a debt amounting to 1.3 pounds, amounting to 30% of the value of our export. In order to pay such debt, we made a loan amounting to 3.7 million pounds in 1824. From that moment on, the debt went on growing. I won't go into the historical details, but I will begin with a few concepts that I consider as being important. And also, I'm going to talk about the financiarization of the Brazilian economy, thinking from an internal and external debt perspective. And I should say that whenever we mention debt, we cannot forget that there is a debtor, a creditor on the other side. So if we own $1.3 trillion, there is someone who is going to receive that money. Moreover, the debt is a long-standing issue, as I mentioned, and it's been fundamental for the development of the capitalist model and also the accumulation of capital in the past 3 to 4 centuries. So when we hear about ending the debt, it does not make sense. We can analyze debt from the perspective of the interests of social classes, institutions, capitalist institutions with its own interests, which can go through making loans to have the interest rates on the loans, and a part of the wealth that is produced, what we call the added value. And within the system, the state became fundamental to ensure and guarantee the development of the capital, and as a consequence, it triggered loans and debts. In parallel, the capital triggers a credit system, especially through the banking system. So we can see the debt from an internal and external debt perspective, also from a public and or private debt perspective. And this is all connected to the credit system. What is the external debt? When capitalists or companies from a country, they own to other countries. That's the external debt. The public external debt is when the government of a country owns money to all the governments or to banks or even capitalists from foreign countries. In the case of Brazil, in the past decades, namely in the past years, we've seen a trend of having its economic power decreasing. You can see in the chart the annual growth rate by the GDP in the past 20 years, and the tendency is to have a decrease. As a consequence, even if we have the recovery of the raw formation of capital, the trend is also of a decrease, and the accumulation of capital wouldn't allow us to have a good development and a growth in our economy again. And it's also important to mention that when the economy does not grow, the income, people's and families' income do not grow either. The living conditions of livelihoods do not change. And we must highlight that a feature of underdeveloped and developing countries such as Brazil, we have a historical trend through which the growth in the economy is accompanied by an increase in inequality. And the inequality can be assessed in terms of property of the goods of production. Capital, countries, lands, both rural and urban property. So the property of the production assets increases the accumulation of capital and of the social classes that actually own the means of production. Whereas the other social classes, namely small bourgeoisie or middle class, the workers, they go on the other way. They lose. They are the ones who often lose. At certain times, these classes might have some privileges, say not losing so much and even accumulating a bit. Finally, we have the basic structure of the economy of dependent, undeveloped countries where wealth is hugely concentrated and poverty is spread all over the country. As I mentioned, this is an old process. We have it for a long time. I'm only reiterating the process that we do have for a very long time. When it comes to the debt, there is one issue. In the past 30 years, we had what we can say the gross external liabilities and the net external liabilities. The gross is the calculation of everything that the government, the people, and the companies owe to banks, owe to people, owed to families that are external.
E se acrescenta dentro do passivo externo os
In these
estrangeiros diretos que
external liabilities, we also have direct investment in the country
chamada de
and also portfolio investments.
podemos observar nesse gráfico
In this chart, you can see that the total liability
a quase 100% do
reached almost 100% of the GDP, whereas
o passivo total
the total liability less external assets have been decreasing in the past century and remained roughly stable. What does it mean? It means that the Brazilian capitalists are remitting resources abroad. The external dependence is gaining a new shape. For instance, taking into account this liability, the Brazilian external asset, because Brazilians, they have resources in the form of bank deposits. In other words, money.
De formas que o problema que nós temos desse passivo externo
As a consequence, the problem that we have with the net liability, external liability, is that Brazil actually owes,
os ativos das empresas que são de
let's say, the assets of companies that belong to foreign capitalists, and the portfolio composed of shares, securities, etc. And we have another feature, because when we talk about foreign direct investment, FDI, about 30% of it is composed of loans. So the
Aí nós temos que a contrapartida do investimento estrangeiro direto é remessa de
we have, on the other hand, remittance of profits. When it comes to loans, you have the payment of interest rates. So we have
os capitais internacionais podem
a problem
administrar,
because
se preferem
international
exterior ou enviar.
capitalists, they prefer to make remittances abroad.
Além disso, no Brasil nós temos mais
Also,
característica
in Brazil,
particular,
we have something that is very specific.
em
In
1997,
1997, 96, 97,
com a distinção entre capital nacional e capital
Brazil no longer differentiated national and foreign capital. It had been established in the Brazilian constitution before. And this difference allowed
brasileiro tivesse uma série de privilégios que os estrangeiros não tinham. Com o fim dessa distinção,
I think we have a technical problem.
capitalistas estrangeiros podem ter os mesmos privilégios que
Well,
os brasileiros.
external capitalists, they can have the same privileges of Brazilians except for some specific cases.
Questão importante. Bom, em termos da dívida do governo,
When it comes to
não é mais importante.
government debt, it's not higher than that actually.
Nesse gráfico, essa linha
If you can see here, this line, this is the external debt.
interno bruto está na ordem aí de 2%.
And when it comes to the GDP, it's about 2%, less than 2%.
Enquanto as reservas chegaram a quase 25%.
In the meantime, the reserves attained almost 25% of the GDP. International reserves are composed of investments made by the Brazilian governments in American bonds. And the total of these reserves total $320 million.
Agora, isso significa também uma outra coisa que é importante
And
em termos da relação entre os países,
We can explain this in another way.
ou o governo brasileiro
When
compra
Brazil
dólar
or the Brazilian government
utiliza os dólares para comprar
purchases dollar and uses dollar in order to buy American bonds,
exportasse
well,
mercadorias, recebesse
it is the
mercadorias,
same as Brazil
recebesse
exporting
dólares
goods
e
and
devolvesse
receiving dollars as a payment and
com isso
gave back the
essas
dollars.
reservas aqui servem
So,
para
therefore, these
financiar a
reserves
política.
are used to fund the American
E não
economy.
é só o Brasil. A China é um
And
país que
that's
tem
and it's not
uma
only
reserva
Brazil.
em dólares
China has a considerable reserve in dollars, maybe much higher than Brazil.
então, a China, a Rússia, o
So
Japão,
China, Russia,
todos eles
Japan,
têm reservas
Germany, France, all
em
countries
títulos da dívida
with
pública que eles
reserves
estão financiando.
in American
Ou
bonds.
seja,
They
o
are, in a
governo
way,
americano
funding
do
the
déficit
American
americano.
government deficit and the American
Então,
deficit.
nesse sentido, eu queria dizer assim,
In this sense,
nesse período mais recente,
in, in
a
recent
dívida
times,
externa não é um problema
the
do
external
Brasil.
debt is
Em
not only a
86,
Brazilian problem.
na década
However,
de 80,
in the 80s,
a, o governo brasileiro
the
nacionalizou uma dívida
Brazilian
externa
government nationalized
com
a private
o
external
aumento
debt
da taxa de juros nos Estados
through
Unidos
the
e os
increase of
capitalistas
profits
brasileiros
in the
transferiram
United
essa
States,
dívida
and the Brazilian
para o
capitalists
governo.
transferred their debts to the government.
Encarregar, teve que assumir o
And the
pagamento dessa
government
dívida.
has undertaken the responsibility to pay the
Atualmente,
interest rates of this debt.
a
At present, the private
agora,
external debt works this way.
parte de toda essa dívida
And
se converteu em dívida
a
interna.
part of
O
this
Brasil hoje
debt
trata da dívida
was
total
converted
e da
into
dívida
internal debt. So you
do
can see
interno bruto.
the net debt in percentage points.
Então, a dívida bruta total
The
está
total
na
gross
ordem de
debt
75,
amounts
quase
to
80% nos
75,
últimos anos.
almost 80% in the past
Só
years, in
que
recent years. However,
essa dívida total eu tenho que a
and
dívida
the total
interna
debt, I have
ela
the internal debt,
é menor.
which is actually lower.
E tem mais uma coisa, eu tenho
And
a
also,
dívida líquida que é menor ainda.
you have
Qual a
an
diferença?
even lower net debt. And what's the difference between the three
Aqui é a
types of
dívida
debt?
interna de
Here
licitação
you have internal and external debts included,
e essa dívida interna que é principalmente
and this internal debt is made of
essa dívida líquida
public
aqui
bonds.
é a diferença entre a dívida do governo
And this is the difference
menos
between the government's debt
recursos que estão dentro do
minus
próprio governo.
resources that are
Acaba
within the
sendo
government.
como se fossem
However,
dívidas.
they are
O principal
considered
caso
as debt. The
é
most
essa dívida
remarkable
interna
case is that
adquirida
this
com títulos
internal
da dívida
debt
pública.
is composed of treasury bonds.
Esses títulos,
And
primeiro,
these bonds
emitidos pelo Tesouro Nacional, vendidos
are
na Bolsa
issued by
Central,
the
vendidos
National
no mercado.
Treasury, sent to the central bank, and sold in the
Guardado
market.
em seu portfólio,
And in its
mais de
portfolio,
20%
it
desses
has about 20%
para
of
vencimento,
these
para que que serve
bonds, and we're
essa
going to
dívida
see what
toda,
they're used for
eu
later
tenho que
on.
colocar um
So,
fruto
taking
que chega
into account all
nos
these debts,
últimos
you
anos,
have
uma
the
média
interest rates that in the past years
do PDG.
have been around 4.5% of the GDP.
Agora, para pagar essa dívida, é
And in order
preciso
to
ter
settle
o
this
chamado
debt,
resultado primário.
we need
Vamos falar um
primary
pouco dessa
results. So
conversa.
let's talk about
A ideia
this
é a seguinte: o
theory.
governo arrecada impostos
So
e
the
realiza
idea is the
publicidade.
following. Government collects
Sobre isso,
taxes
tem toda uma discussão chamada da
and makes the public spending. And of course,
essa
then we
discussão
can talk about
baseia
austerity.
pressupostos
And
falsos,
this discussion is based on
falsos
fake promises.
reproduzidas e assim.
They are fake, but they are
A ideia
reproduced.
básica é a seguinte:
And the
o governo não
basic
pode ser
idea
como
is the
uma
following.
família,
The government
gastar
cannot
mais do
be
que recebe.
as a family. They cannot uh,
Isso é bom.
spend more than it earns.
Detalhar tudo
That's
isso por falta de
theory. And I won't
E aí,
of lack of time.
em 2016, foi aprovada uma emenda constitucional que congelou os gastos públicos até 2027, por 20 anos.
And the government has freezed public spending in order to multiply the primary result. And the freezing of public spending is limited to tax-related spending, not financial spending. So the interest rates paid on the internal debt is established by the Brazilian Central Bank, which is independent, and it can pay as much as it wants. At present, it is 13.75% per year. That's the interest rate at present, which is not the effective rate, which is a different one. Anyway, the government has to put in place a policy through the savings of its public spending and in order to pay interest rates. But this economy, it has to be lower than the debt. And as a consequence, we produce more debts and it goes on and on. It only increases. Who has this debt? Here you can see December 2022, 43.5% belongs to mutual funds, both national and foreign, and 29.1% correspond to proprietary holdings. They're owned by proprietary holdings. And the other parts are important members, but these are the major two parts holding the internal Brazilian debt, and of course are interested in having higher interest rates. A major part of the debt is, of course, banking credit. Here you can see in blue the total credit created by the banking system. It is in average 48% of the GDP. That's the final balance. This banking credit has a special feature in Brazil. A part of it is subsidized. So a part of the interest rates are not paid by these capitalists. And in average, it represents more than 40% of the total credit. In other words, a fourth of the GDP. What about the interest rates that are charged by the banks? They are, in blue, 37.5% during this period in average. So you can see the subsidized is about 8.92%. So as you can see, for the companies, the families, so that they can be able to freely operate, they also need loans. And these are the interest rates they pay. But this is kind of something fun so that you can have a picture of it. But going into details, breaking down, what do we have? When it comes to loans, we have what we call a turnover credit, which is the overdraft check, actually, and the interest rates amounts to 474% per year. And you have the 10 major banks, the 10 major collectors of these overdraft charges: Santander, Banco do Brasil, Bradesco, Caixa Econômica Federal. They are the 5 largest sized banks in Brazil in terms of assets. They hold about 80% of assets, and these are the rates they practice. And we have another issue which is very complex as well, which is the credit card. It goes from 500% per year, reaching 1,200% per year. Such an economy cannot work because it's certainly serving specific and private interests. In order to have it working, you need not only the government, but any structure that serves this interest, such as the central bank board that will legitimize such rates. So a regulation system that allows this reality to take place. And in parallel, the legal system, the prosecutors, the magistrates, the judges, who make an interpretation of the legislation that make these outrageous rates legal.
Esqueci agora o termo específico, mas é tudo brincadeira perto disso. Lugar nenhum do mundo tem taxas de juros.
In no place in the world you have so high interest rates. So here I have the average interest rates. 50% of total credit has an average rate amounting to almost 38%, and here you can include rates amounting to 400% that serve very, very specific interests. Now, when it comes to this difference I mentioned before, the Brazilian Central Bank say it needs 1.5 trillion Brazilian reais. So 20% of the total internal debt in order to cover the transactions in the open market. On a daily basis, all markets and families deposit in the bank, and all the money, all the extra money in the bank is invested in the night. This is what we call overnight transactions, committed overnight transactions. The daily average volume from 2011 to 2020 is of 16% of the Brazilian GDP in a single day. In other words, the banking system is highly interested in having a central bank maintaining such rates so that it can guarantee these transactions. So these transactions are guaranteed by the central bank and its bonds. Here you have the evolution in recent years. As you can see, the daily volume of transactions, the average per month. And here you have the yearly average. So these are complex data. They deserve detailing, and I don't have much time, indeed. But in any case, this data allows us to better understand the context of interests that we have in the Brazilian economy. And as a consequence, 70 to 80% of the population is made of poor population, miserable population, more than 100 people in a situation of high poverty here in Brazil. And Rogério and Rosa will certainly go into details of the Brazilian context. So I conclude my presentation. I'd like to thank you very much for the attention. And then when it comes to the Q&A session, we can discuss further details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paulo. And then the second speaker is Professor Rogério Naques Barreiros. He is a professor. He is a professor at the Department of Economics and Postgraduate Program in Social Policy, Federal University of Espírito Santo in Victoria, Brazil. He served as a director of the Center for Legal and Economic Science between 2013 and 2020 and was a provost for planning and institutional development at the Federal University of Espírito Santo between 2020 and 2023. Professor Ferraros is the core member of E7 research team from Brazil. He also attended the first South-South Forum in Hong Kong and also the second South-South Forum in Chongqing. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Rogerio, thank you.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation, the personal Professor J and Professor Kinshi, and also our student, Maisa Amaral, our student, PhD student who is in Hong Kong. I'd like to extend this thanks to our interpreters that will allow us to communicate throughout this session, a morning session in Brazil and an evening session in Hong Kong. It's a pleasure to be in the presence of Professors Rosa Marques and Paulo Nakatani, two scholars that are very dear to my professional history. And the presentation I will share with you today has a particular feature. It is more a description to try to provide to our colleagues in China and Hong Kong, and also the others who are following us, to share with them a picture of what was the reality of Brazil during the 4 years of the Bolsonaro government between 2019 and 2022. I would qualify this 4 years as a social chaos, not only social chaos, but also economic and environmental chaos. Environment is a very important aspect of the damage that's being caused by the Bolsonaro government. But before I start addressing Bolsonaro's government, it's very important to remind ourselves of the brief history of what came before the emergence of the political right-wing force in Brazil. Bolsonaro is a political character that was really not significant. Although he had been a federal member of parliament for more than 20 years, he has never been known by his proposals or projects presented to the Congress or for the country. He grew in the context of the impeachment that we call very simply a coup that was operated against President Dilma Rousseff. That was a context of a very serious economic crisis. Here we see the numbers, as Professor Paulo has shown, that the economy had a negative growth. It was a very serious economic crisis. It was a context of this legal operation that was called in Portuguese Lava Jato. It would be a car wash operation that was responsible for the destruction of the Brazilian industrial sector. There's very important information here. In 2016, Brazil was contributing with 2.5% of the exports of engineering service. And today, our contribution in the international market in our total export of engineering service is 0.5. This points to the destruction of important sectors of the Brazilian infrastructure. I'm talking about construction. I'm talking about also oil drilling. And in this context of what came before the Bolsonaro government, there was the growing role of social media and mass media, such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, and the mass media had also a very important role in raising the population, in bringing the population to the streets against President Dilma. In the context of the impeachment, labor and social security reforms were trying to be enabled in favor of the rich, of course, in favor of financial capital. And we also have to consider a context of class hatred that was like the opening of the Brazilian society Pandora's box, as put by the sociologist Florestan Fernandes. So Brazil is a country that is characterized by a very specific pattern of social struggle, of class struggle. So it's characterized by the hatred of those who are in the high classes against the lower classes. We have to also consider in this scenario what was the international situation. Dilma Rousseff's government in the international scene, they were growing closer to the Chinese economy, and I would like to talk here about I'm talking here about the constitution of the BRICS group, but also in terms of the Chinese investment in the Brazilian economy. Dilma worked to grow closer to the Chinese. The port of Taqui in Maranhão is an example of this type of investment. So it was a huge port in the north part of Brazil, connected through railways to the central and east parts of Brazil. And that meant to create a channel to export the grains from that region to Asia. So this fact that Brazil was growing closer to China, Russia through the BRICS, that created tension with the United States and, of course, also with the European Union. So it's important to say that one of the central characters, Sérgio Moro, the judge Sérgio Moro, who had visited many times the United States and was supported by legal advising by the United States, as we know. So this is the situation that brought Bolsonaro to be a protagonist of Brazilian politics. In that context, we also have to remind that President Lula was in jail in São Paulo because of the false accusations against him through the Lava Jato, the car wash operation. So I'd like to highlight once again the importance of social media and the sharing of fake news, the importance that this has there. Maybe after the protests of 2013 and then the coup against President Dilma in 2016 was the first case in Brazil of the massive use of social media in Brazilian politics. So after this first introduction of the context, I'm going to divide my talk in three different talking points. So first, I'm going to talk about the environmental issue. And then I'm going to talk about the social aspects of the crisis. And I will end with a brief discussion on how the Bolsonaro has dealt or not dealt with the pandemic. So the pandemic increased some characteristics of the inequality of our society. Regarding the environmental issue, I would like to mention the deforestation rates in the legal Amazon region. So during Lula's government, during Lula's administration, we see that was a decrease in deforestation in the legal Amazon. And over the past 4 years with Bolsonaro, we had a 73.3 increase in the deforestation rate in the legal Amazon, and I'm mentioning the territory that that covers 7 or 8 states. So this, where you see the red areas here, is the main deforestation areas in Roraima, Acre, Maranhão, Tocantins, Mato Grosso, Rondônia, and Pará. So here I have some data about this increase of the deforestation, and we'll see here how it's been growing, the deforestation in the Amazon. In 2022, we have the information of 11.5 thousand kilometers. It would be 3,000 soccer fields in a day. So these are some images also, and in order for you to understand, to give you a sense of what is happening. So this is tearing down the trees, the fires, and then the illegal logging. This is the tragedy of the Bolsonaro government over the past 4 years. And why did it happen? I have some information here about how Brazil, during the Bolsonaro administration, became this outcast in the environmental aspect of the international scenario. So Brazil did not participate in the Latin American Pact that protects the rights of environmentalists. Brazil did not participate in the 2020 Climate Ambition Summit in Paris. Actually, Brazil proposed goals that were actually lower than the international ones. And Ricardo Salles, this gentleman in the picture, he was the environment minister, and he extinguished, just like that, the Secretariat for Climate Change and Forest. So all the researches by the government analyzing the impact of climate change, all of that was extinguished. The Amazon Fund was also eliminated. It was maintained with resources from Germany and Norway, and it had a guiding committee of the Amazon Fund, COFA, in addition to hundreds of collegiate bodies distinguished by the presidential decree issued in 2019. This was a tragic bill that excluded the possibility of popular participation in decision making, and also impair the participation of specialists in these decisions in the government. So this is a trait of this administration's authoritarian characteristics, and it had a great impact in the Brazilian environment. It's also important to highlight that under the direction of Ricardo Salles, IBAMA and ICMBio, two environmental inspection bodies, were dismantled, and they have reduced 34% in a 34% the fines and assessment in 2019. So many of the regional branches of these bodies were completely disarticulated. They did not appoint the people who should be directing their operations. So as a result, there was a 34% reduction in the fines. And we see that deforestation has been growing over 70%. So this indicates how the institutions of the Bolsonaro administration work in favor of death, of destruction. So the dismantling of IBAMA, ICMBio, and the guiding committee, they had been underfunded in the context of the Bolsonaro administration. So we have here some pictures of Ricardo Salles and Bolsonaro on his side. This is oil spills on the coast. This is the impact of mining. This shows the impact of mining, the destruction of the forest, and the pollution of the waters, particularly with mercury. So this shows that the Bolsonaro administration was giving a free pass for the extraction, the illegal extraction of wood, the deforestation for raising cattle. And so this is the situation that is characteristic of the Bolsonaro administration in terms of the environment. And of course, I cannot forget to mention the genocide of the Yanomami people, which is probably the highest point of Bolsonaro's policy of destruction. Let's take a look at the information. Since June 2021, the Bolsonaro government had information about the nutritional deficit of the Yanomami people. Nonetheless, Bolsonaro excluded the Yanomami people from the food distribution actions. So actively, the government has denied the support towards the population that needed a policy supporting them in getting access to food. So it's important to know that the Yanomami people, they are greatly nomad and they need an area, a reservation that has to be very extensive so they can be able to reproduce their culture, their food system, and their society. With the presence of mining companies in their territory, with the deforestation and the pollution, dismantling the natural resources is dismantling their own means of life, and these populations will be absolutely vulnerable to starvation, to malnutrition, and death. So this is a very tragic information. 570 children under the age of 5 died over the last 4 years, all of them because of preventable causes: lack of vaccination, lack of food, or diseases that had already been controlled in our country in the past. So this also explains, this is also an element for us to see how deliberate was Bolsonaro's destruction policy. Mining in Yanomami lands grew, on the other hand, 54% in 2022, with the destruction of 1,882 hectares. Here we see the curve of the increase of the destruction caused by mining in Yanomami lands. This is a picture of a mining operation. You see the pollution of the rivers. Here the starving children, and here the work of the healthcare workers of the Brazilian public health system. So it's important to highlight that the Bolsonaro administration had information about the nutritional deficit of the Yanomami people. Well, As a second talking point, the second part of my presentation will make reference to the aspects that are the social aspect of the Bolsonaro administration. In a context of the impoverishment of the population, the context of people not having access to drinkable water, basic sanitation structure. So first of all, I'd like to bring the information here for us to compare and get curious about a comparison between the GDP in Brazil and China between 2000 and 2021. Can you see the gap here that was created between these two economies over the past 2 decades? So in 2000, the Chinese GDP is double the Brazilian GDP. By 2021, it's 11 times the Brazilian GDP. So Brazilian economy has been completely paralyzed, which is very typical, as Professor Paulo said, of a situation of external dependency. In the second, we see the per capita GDP in dollars, and it shows how today the per capita GDP, how much the Chinese GDP per capita exceeds the Brazilian GDP. So it also indicates that the income in China is growing higher, while the Brazilian GDP per capita is decreasing. So the last aspect of this comparison is the unemployment rate. Today we have an unemployment rate of 14.4, while China is dealing with a 4.8 rate of unemployment in percent of the labor force. So this comparison indicates that here we have a state with very low growth, very low development, and the consequence is the growth of poverty among the Brazilian population. Here the pictures show the state of poverty. Hunger is unfortunately today again a reality in our country. The lack of dignified housing for an important part of the population, the work conditions in increasingly precarious conditions, and the growth of the population that lives in the streets in the cities because of the lack of access to public policy. So maybe this is the most important slide in my presentation because it shows how the Brazilian economy has entered over the past years in a permanent stagnation. So any strategies of improving the social conditions of the Brazilian population would require higher economic growth strategies. So some other information about poverty in Brazil during Bolsonaro's administration. So according to the National Institute of Research, we had a record of 62.5 million people living in poverty. That means almost 30% of Brazilians. Other 17.9 million Brazilians, 80.4% of the population, are living in extreme poverty. And here, of course, according to the World Bank criteria, what we see here is the per capita income of $5.5 as the poverty line. So the extreme poor are those who have an income that is lower than $1.9. So another aspect of poverty is shown in the fact that 35 million Brazilians live without access to treated water, and around 100 million do not have access to sewage collection. This is information from Agência Senado, it's an official institution. So here in this table, we have how the poverty is distributed. So it's concentrated in the northeast region of the country, mostly in the northeast. Here is the total population, and here we have the population living in extreme poverty. And here the population in a situation of poverty. So there's an important participation here of the northeast region, and next is the southeast region, where the population is higher. I believe that Professor Rosa Marques will address this, but that is maybe the most important problem to be faced by the Lula's administration. So this diagnosis is really frightening, very negative for Brazil. So this is a bit like the other side of the concentration of income that Professor Paulo showed. This is the other side of the story. How the Brazilian population is producing, Brazilian economy is producing, on one hand, very rich people with a consumption that can be even higher of the rich than that of the rich countries, and on the other hand, it produces this extreme inequality, like the inequality we see here in these pictures. So this is another side of poverty and of the actions of destruction by Bolsonaro's administration. Now I'm going to start with the picture. When Bolsonaro's administration started, Bolsonaro made speeches, irresponsible and offensive speeches about the More Doctors program, Mass Médicos, which was a program created by the Workers' Party administration, and it included the doctors from Cuba coming to Brazil to work on basic health care, and also to work to operate in regions of Brazil where Brazilian doctors wouldn't go. So after many offenses against the Cuban people by Bolsonaro, the Cuban government has decided to conclude the program, and the Cuban doctors went back to Cuba. That meant leaving people unattended in the most distant parts of Brazil, in the Amazon forest, in Pantanal, in the north, in the northeast part of Brazil. So one of the first actions by the Bolsonaro administration was the dismantling of a healthcare program which was successful. So I can ask you, is it not a destruction policy? So going back to the tables, this is about vaccination coverage for children in Brazil. So against poliomyelitis, In 2011, it was 100% coverage. We had 100% coverage, and it has fallen in 2021 to 69% coverage. So these programs, these vaccination programs, were also dismantled, or the minimum recommended by the World Health Organization is 95%. Here about serious diarrhea, the coverage of the vaccination, it reached 94% in 2013 under Dilma Rousseff, and it fell to 70% in 2021. Here, the triple vaccination against smallpox and other diseases until 2014, we had 100% coverage, and it fell to 73% in 2021. And the minimum indicated by the World Health Organization is always 95%. The vaccination against tuberculosis that also reached 100% in 2018 fell to 68% in 2021. So this indicates how dismantling and underfunding ministries and programs and putting an end to the programs that were most important for the poor is dismantling the healthcare system. And this decreases that we have seen here, it has everything to do with something that was mentioned by Professor Paulo, which is the taxes regime and the measure, the effects of the spending cap, the EC95. That is, the spending cap is necropolitic in operation. So the limitation of spending public funds is necropolitic. And these are the impacts in healthcare, education, and the environment. For us to understand this dynamic over the past 7 years, okay? So this is when the cap starts operating. And here we have on the blue line the budget, this is the real budget, and this is the trend of the stability of those budgets. This is reproduced also in healthcare. Education and the environment. So here in the environment, we had really a decrease. So let's see, for a country that wants to overcome poverty and improve the quality of life of their population, the mere continuation of the budget for healthcare, education is not enough. That has to be increasing over time. But our fiscal system now establishes that has to be limited to certain rates. And that indicates how progressively the health ministry, the education ministry, and the environment ministry have been underfunded. Here we see that here the blue line indicates the Brazilian population between 0 and 14 years old. In orange, we see the population of the age of more than 60 years old. So for the first time in 2036, we will see the population over 60 years old overpassing the population, the young population. So this represents the aging of the population. So the demands for healthcare will be increased, and that is not being reflected in the budget. Here we see the income. So the growth of the population, consider the income. And we have the growth of the population living in extreme poverty. In red, we see the growth of poverty, the projection for the growth of poverty in Brazil. This is extreme poverty in blue, in red, poverty, in green, the average income, and high income in orange. So you can see that these two green and orange curves are not altering over time, while poverty grows. So Brazil is a country, and I will quote Florestan Fernandes, Brazil has a sociopathic resistance to change. So in the high income, we have the people who are benefiting from the data shown by Professor Paulo Nakatami. And the spending cap, the EC95, is the legacy of Mr. Michel Temer, who was the president of the country after the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the ascension, the coming to power of Bolsonaro. So this is the political character who's responsible for the spending cap. So here on this table, we see the age pyramid of the Brazilian population. So it's a picture of the president, of how the population is going old as the bottom of the pyramid is growing narrower. Finally, I will talk about the pandemics. Brazil, in updated data, Brazil had 698,834 deaths. It's the country where people died more of COVID than any other part of the world. We should not forget this number, because this has been dismissed by Bolsonaro in an interview when talking about the deaths related to COVID. In the beginning of the pandemic, he said the following: "So what? I am not the grave man," showing all his insensibility, all his lack of empathy, all his lack of preparation for being in the position of a president. So this quote is probably the highest point, or the symbol of the killing drive of Bolsonaro's administration. It was an administration seeking the death of the Brazilian people. We should never forget this number. And here we have the curve of the death rates over the different waves of infection. So this is our world data. The different waves of death related to COVID, and of course that represented a worldwidely a challenge. So some other information about COVID in Brazil. Here we have the 10 countries where there were the greatest numbers of death, rates of death. So Brazil comes second after the United States. This information can sometimes be can change because of how the data was collected. Then comes India, the Russian Federation, Mexico, Peru, the United Kingdom, Italy, Germany, and France. So here we have the United States on the map, Brazil and India as the countries where more people died from COVID. For a very simple comparison, we have Brazil representing 10% of the deaths by COVID, but Brazil in the world population represents only 2.6%. So proportionally, people died a lot of COVID in Brazil. And COVID for us, the Brazilians, it was a mix of sadness, of pain, of losing our dear ones or relatives, losing friends. It was a mix of rage and sadness, of a feeling of abandonment by the government. And they have also blocked the vaccination program. So it represented the Bolsonaro administration represents death for Brazil. Considering the specialists on the topic, there's this very interesting document I'm basing my presentation on, produced by Abrasco, a Brazilian Society for Collective Health. That this document points the mistakes in facing the pandemics according to experts. So what were the mistakes that the Bolsonaro administration mistakes? It was a mistake, the low testing, the low isolation of the cases and quarantine of the context. It was a mistake to use clinical and not a population-based approach. So other types of policy were important too. So the population-based approach based on prevention, the focus on the use of the IPE. So this kind of care that could not be implemented because of the lack of doctors, and the Cuban doctors had left. So this gentleman here, you see with the mask on his nose, this was the education ministry, General Pazuello. The picture is enough to tell how they treated the use of masks. So Bolsonaro has also promoted the use of drugs that were not efficient, scientifically proved inefficient drugs. This kind of treatment was not science-based, and Bolsonaro has personally promoted this drug called hydroxychloroquine in a complete dismissal of research and science. That is another characteristic of an obscurantist administration. There was a delay of purchasing vaccine. The case of the Coronavac, the Chinese vaccines were discarded by the administration, the federal administration, but an institute in São Paulo managed to operate the purchase of the vaccines and the production. So the discouraging of the vaccination, the lack of leadership from the Ministry of Health, and the lack of a committee of experts. It was an administration that was closed in their own ignorance. And there was a lack of a unified communication policy. So according to Abrasco, according to experts, these were the mistakes, the very basic mistakes committed by Bolsonaro's administration in challenging the pandemics. But the pandemic had other aspects because it mixed with the enormous inequality of our country. Here is the Gini index in Brazil. The Gini index, as you know, is a measurement of inequality in many countries based on data from the World Bank. And you can see here how it's been falling until 2016, when there's a coup. And then the Gini index increases again. Here we have a temporary moment when there is some financial aid policy, but the projection is that it will quickly rise up to the level it was in 2019. So this is about the relation once established between the pandemic and inequality in the country. So until the coup, inequality was decreasing, and then it goes back up. So this shows a reality of extreme inequality in Brazilian cities. This is a picture of Rio de Janeiro. This is a very rich area of Rio de Janeiro, and then there's the favela. This is a very classic picture of São Paulo. We have here this building with a tennis court that here in Brazil is a very elite thing. And here's the favela. And here is a picture of the reality of public transportation in Brazil in major cities. So there's the bus full of people. So what would be the possibility of these people to actually protect themselves from the pandemic? So the pandemic brought to light the inequality of the Brazilian population. It affected everyone, but actually it impacted more the people who were depending on public transportation, the people who, because of their characteristics of their houses, could not be socially isolated. So life in a favela is the community life, and the challenges for social isolation were enormous in these areas. So an important part of the number of people who died during the pandemic were the poor. Here we have a picture from a very painful event in Brazil, in the city of Manaus, in Amazonas, the lack of oxygen in the hospital. So these are people holding this the oxygen bottles, trying to get them recharged in private institutions. Here's the hospital full of sick people, and this picture is of a man in South Africa, not Brazil, but it's the case of Brazilians in that difficulty of having access to individual protection equipment. So, by the end of Bolsonaro's administration, a parliamentary commission of inquiry was created, and the conclusions were that the government showed evident disregard for people's lives, evidenced by the deliberate delay in acquiring vaccine, the strong performance of the top administration, especially the President of the Republic, in the dissemination of fake news about the pandemic, the existence of a parallel office that advised the President with information that was completely opposite to scientific guidelines, the intention of the administration to immunize the population through natural contamination, what they would call herd immunity, was not considering the risks of death, the prioritization of early treatment without scientific evidence or effectiveness, and the adoption of the model as the adoption of that model as a declared public policy, the discouragement of the use of non-pharmacological measures such as the use of masks and social distancing, and the practice by the federal government of acts deliberately directed against the rights of indigenous people. So this was a result of the inquiry that was officially led within the Brazilian Senate. Finally, the following crimes have been identified: an epidemic resulting in death, the breach of preventive health measures, charlatanism, incitement to crime, the forgery of private documents, the irregular use of public funds, malfeasance, and crimes against humanity. Of course, on top of the crimes of responsibility, meaning the violation of social law and incompatibility with dignity, honor, and decorum of his political position. Not by chance, this is the aircraft taking Bolsonaro in December to Florida. He did not participate in the ceremony of Lula's inauguration, and Lula was accompanied by representatives of different social groups. And it is known that from the United States, Bolsonaro has also helped to stimulate the event of January 8th. So today he's out of the country under very serious charges that will require from the Brazilian legal system some kind of action. So this is a very hard picture to look at of what was the Bolsonaro government reality for the Brazilian population. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Sorry to be over time, and this was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have the last speaker, Rosa Maria Marquez. She is professor at the Department of Economics and the Postgraduate Studies Program in Political Economy at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo in Brazil. She was president of the Brazilian Society of Political Economy and a member of the Budget and Finance Commission of the National Health Council. She was president of the Brazilian Association of Health Economics from 2012 to 2016. She has experience in the areas of economics with emphasis on the labor market, government policy, contemporary economy, acting mainly on the following topics: social policy, health economics, health finance, wealth of work, social security and protection, and contemporary capitalism. Now, I would like to invite Professor Marques to present her topic, the transition and the challenges of the rural government. Thank you.
Boa tarde, bom dia a todos. Eu, antes de tudo, queria
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you, also together with Paulo and Rogério, to see Jade. So thank you very much, everyone. Can you see my presentation? Can you see my screen? Yes or no? So first of all, I would like to say that I don't have slides that have been so beautifully prepared, such as Rogério and Paulo, especially Rogério. And actually, I won't bring figures. If I remember the slides I prepared, I haven't included any figures. And that's precisely because we are discussing Brazil through layers, through perspectives, focused on specific areas. And here I'm going to talk about the transition of the government and the challenges faced by Lula's government. So this is an ongoing discussion. It's taking place now, of course. There are several elements one can mention so that you can better understand the difficulties we are facing right now. I'll try and make a speech in 3 parts. First part, I think it's important to understand the circumstances and the context of the new government. The second part, I'll be discussing the transitions and the tasks. And finally, in the third part, the challenges of the new Lula government. And when I mention challenges, I include the challenges that have been determined by the circumstances in which he takes office. So let me get started. The circumstances and the context, the first part, is divided in points. So starting with a point, which is the circumstances and the context from a political point of view. So I have the political point of view 1 and 2. So it's important to say that Lula was elected for the 3rd time as the president of the country, and this is unprecedented in Brazil. You know, yesterday I was reading a book and I was flabbergasted when I heard that Roosevelt was elected 4 times, and in his last mandate he was only 1 year in his term because he passed away. So it is interesting to remember of Roosevelt because, you know, often we hear that people who are willing to take power again or who want to stay in power for 3, 4 mandates are actually dictators. In this sense, Lula wouldn't allow others to take his place, so on and so forth. Well, we can say, what about Roosevelt? He was president 4 times. Anyway, it's very different from the victory we had in 2002 and 2022. Not only Lula is 20 years older, and we can see that he's older when he appears, when he talks, No, when he gives interviews to the press. So let's remember something. What is the meaning of the victory in 2002? I usually say it's the corollary of a democratization process. You know, another corollary would be the enactment of the 1988 Brazilian Federal Constitution. But if we think in terms of political process, a corollary is Lula's victory in the year 2002. You should remember, at least the oldest participants should remember that during that election in 2002, the Workers' Party, which was not the same it used to be in the 80s, because the Workers' Party was created in 1980 here in São Paulo, in Sion School, and it was the result of a coalition of forces represent 95% of all progressive and left-wing forces in the society. And this coalition was represented as a big political base with representations in each neighborhood, in each school, in each association. So in year 2002, the Workers' Party had already been through a process of, so as to say, accommodation to the political environment. And in this election, the red color, which is the Workers' Party color, was not part of the election campaign. I don't know if you remember that. But once Lula is elected, people take to the streets with the red flags. So there was a symbolism surrounding this victory. And for the first time in Brazil, a political party having a workers' political base, I could say that each and every trade union was part of its base. Well, this party took power. At that moment, there was a signal to the dominant classes, so as to say, which is actually the vice president of Lula. And in comparison, 20 years later, in 2022, we have a completely different victory. First of all, although the Workers' Party is still the strongest political party, the having Lula and Alckmin running together is a, how can I say, united front platform in which you have left-wing movements associated to dominant movements. And one example of this platform is the fact that we have Alckmin as a vice president. And not so long ago, Alckmin used to be a member of PSDB political party, a political party that had actually taken part in the coup against Dilma. It was not only the PMDB political party represented by Michel Temer, not only the political party that Alckmin used to be a part of, PSDB, was always in the opposition. Today, he's no longer in this party. He's at PSD. In any case, he's a person with a political background that reveals someone who was not on the side of workers. When he was the governor of the state of São Paulo, which is the strongest economic states in Brazil, and also in terms of population, when he was a governor, he always adopted policies and legislation against the workers. However, this broad front was fantastic as well, because we had in this broad front several sectors from political perspective, in terms of social classes, and they were all together because this was a fight between civilization against barbarism. Rogério mentioned the word chaos. I enjoyed the expression. Actually, I enjoyed the expression that you used, the pulsion for the death. I think that this is the very translation of what we had been going through. That's the total barbarian, this death drive. So the class interests, financial interests, they are always present. However, there is one moment, there is one situation, certain circumstances where people who belong to a class that is traditionally opposed to workers, they reach a limit, they attain a point which represents the total destruction. And I'm going to talk about that later on. The total destruction of the state and of the social tissue. The Brazilian society was about to become dust, and it will take very long for us to reconstruct our society. So in such circumstances, we had sectors from different origins getting together. So in a way, this conforms the new government. Of course, that it's mostly a Workers' Party government, but it is also a broad front. I have to pay attention to the time because I have been given 30 minutes. So now for the B section, from a political point of view too. I want to talk about something very serious now. We have to understand that society is no longer the same. The Brazilian society in 2022 is not the same one we had in 2002. It's a pity that I haven't included election maps in my presentation showing the first time election, Lula got elected, the second time he was elected, when Dilma was elected, and now, because these maps show that after the first election of Lula in 2002, the map goes red, meaning Lula won in most states in Brazil. These same states are divided in the second election. They are part red and part blue. This goes on, and we had things taking place, but we from the left, we from the progressive side, we haven't given the importance it deserved. In a way, Lula has abandoned the construction of its social base. This was a relevant factor in this change I've just mentioned, because there was a gap created by workers' parties' abandonment in the construction of the social base. Also, the end of the theology of liberation, because it was an important part of the construction of social bases. And in parallel to that, we have the emergence of the evangelical churches, but not any evangelical churches, but the denialists. When it comes to understanding life, the facts of life, and here, of course, I'm talking about science, and also when it comes to their social behavior. You know, if you take them from the poorest to the wealthiest, because when it comes to ideology, it's not the income that is the most important factor, but a set of factors. And it is interesting to see the advancement of this idea of meritocracy. So person attained something because it fought for it, because it worked for it. And in the same time, a total denial in relation to principles of solidarity and the collective. So during Lula's first term, his second term as well, and Dilma's government, we had a middle class that was positioned against social policies of inclusion. And this situation came to the current situation in which we have concrete actions. Another important aspect we should bear in mind is that the radical right was massively voted in, and today is very well represented in the Chamber of MPs. And you know who are they? We wrote an article about it because Rogério made the presentation and he showed these criminals that were appointed as ministers, such as Ricardo Salles for the environment, Pazuello, the general that was the Ministry of Health. They all have been elected, and today they do represent states in the MPs, Chamber of MPs, and at the Senate. You have this woman, Damares, Mrs. Damares. When she came to the public stage, I thought it was a joke, the things she said, but actually she's now a senator. So let's pay attention. We have a third term to Lula. However, the context is connected to a broad front. That's the first thing. Secondly, the society today is very different. A relevant part of this population voted for Bolsonaro because the difference was really minimum. And it's no use for us to say they had the machine on their hands, they were in power, they did this and they did that in relation to voting. What really matters is the prevailing ideas in this society, because it seems we are having a re-emergence of these far-right groups and social networks. I have to speed up. Let me see, I'm lost. Sorry. See, yes. From an internal economic point of view, it's still in the first section. So my comrades mentioned some facts. And in the last 8 years, taking into account Bolsonaro's administration and Temer's administration, Temer who took power right after the coup, our growth was ridiculous. It began with a huge recession that led to 7% decrease in our GDP. Then we recovered, reaching 2% growth. And even considering, even if we don't take COVID into account, it's been accompanied by a drop in the investment. We were not able to see the difference between public and private investment because, the other day I was quite shocked when I heard that the public investment is 2% of the GDP. This is crazy. Also, another factor that took place in the last 80 years, disindustrialization, which cost us a lot during the pandemic because we were totally dependent on the production from China, from India, because we didn't have production capacity to produce the individual protection equipment. And I'm not talking about masks. We also had a fall in the average income. rise in unemployment and with a huge increase in informality and precarious work. And as it has been mentioned, we had the return of hunger, poverty, and increase in inequality rates. Well, I don't need to go over the figures again, but I wanted to remind you that we had to witness people, not only one person or two people, lots of people who were looking for food in the trash or bones. At the very beginning, they could grab the bones for free, and then they were sold. Even the bones were sold to the poorest. So what do I mean by internal economic perspective? What I'm trying to say here is that from an economic perspective, we have huge inequality. When it comes to the labor market, we've had some improvements during Lula and Dilma's administration, but it was deteriorated with increase in unemployment, increase in informality, and precarious work. Regarding the production in the country, well, the country no longer invests, and also we are going through a deindustrialization process. But from the external economic perspective, the situation is not good either. You see, prior to COVID, the IMF had a forecast saying that we would have a slow turn in the economy, and that was prior to the COVID. And in parallel, they mentioned that IMF mentioned that we had a higher participation of high-risk investment in transactions carried out worldwide. So the situation was already problematic. We already had a slowdown in several countries with high-risk speculation increasing sharply. After the COVID's peak, we had a supply inflation and an offer inflation because the weakest part of global supply chains have not been recovered. Here in Brazil, when you see the manufacture of automobiles, it is freezed, paralyzed because we didn't have access to microchips. And the same is valid for telecommunications. On the top of that, you have the war in Ukraine. So what is the result? A slowdown of world economy and increased uncertainty. And I mention these aspects because during Lula's first term, the world economy was was in a boom with the commodities and etc. So we have to take all of this into account to understand the current situation. When it comes to the capacity to act, and so in the past 4 years, and here I mentioned Bolsonaro, but it actually started in 2017, which is the freezing of public expenditure amendment. Since the enactment of this piece of legislation, we had the beginning of the destruction of the state. And it's really a destruction of the state with a reduction in the number of employees in several areas. Say, when it comes to pension funds and social, many people retired and they were in a very dire situation. Also, you have the federal environment institute that was disinvested. So we had a reduction in the number of workers, of employees. We also had the freezing of salaries in this period. I mentioned the last 4 years, so as to say. And together with that, you had the extinction of programs and departments that were key to implement policies, state policies. Also, even worse, well, I don't know what's worse because we have one thing on the top of another thing, but we witnessed the discontinuity in the feeding of databases. In his presentation, Rogério included some forecasts about the population. It's okay, but I wonder, we don't have a census. We don't know what's the size of the Brazilian population. We have forecasts, we have projections, but a census, a real census, we don't have it. We don't have a real survey. But what I'm trying to say is that Brazil is going through demographic changes, and the forecasts are not capable of including these trends. We need a survey, a census. And apparently we're going to have a new one in the near future, but they say that the quality of data will be quite poor. In any case, in parallel to the reduction of the state, you have the freezing of public spending and the decrease of the capacity of the banking system. So we used to have these institutions that were inducers of growth, and they are no longer, and they have been deteriorated in their capacity. If you see the Brazilian Development Bank, it became nothing. The same is valid to Brazil Bank, Caixa Econômica Bank. These institutions have been paralyzed or induced to inappropriate policies. And here again, I would like to remind you that on the top of that, since December 2016, the Brazilian tax regime was freezed. It's now established in the Constitution that the public budget is freezed for the period of 20 years. And differently from other countries that did not set forth such a disposition, such a provision in their legislation, in their constitution. Here in Brazil, we included the freezing of social spending, and we haven't freezed the spending for paying public debt and interests on public debt. I'm not saying that it's not important to limit the expansion of expenditure, but what I'm saying is that even in other countries where public spending has been limited, nothing can be compared to what happened in Brazil. So this is the context in which Lula takes office for the third time. And I'd like to draw your attention to another aspect. In this 20-year period of time, we've witnessed the advancement of the power, of the dominance, of the interests of the so-called financial capital. Also, the acceptance of neoliberal principles in the relationship between the state and society. We have witnessed a decrease in social policies and an increase in the meritocracy, in the belief in meritocracy. And also we've witnessed the emergence of predatory action on nature and against the native people. So, thinking about the dialectics, we had a qualitative leap. The dominance of the financial capital is so much higher and higher in economic terms, but also when it comes to having their principles prevailing in the society and being reproduced by anyone, including low-income people producing these principles. The predatory action on nature. Apologies, but very little, uh, I mean, a very small portion of the Brazilian population is open to this debate because the people, they want to defend their struggle first, and they think this is not an important issue. So these factors put all together compose the scenario where the new government will have to operate. So we have huge limitations if we compare to 2003. Lula, as far as I know, and as far as I've seen, Lula, differently from other leaders in Latin America, he's not gonna have his bases on the street. He's gonna privilege agreements, so agreements at the Chamber of MPs, agreements at the Senate, which can be a problem because the right wing and the radical right is highly present in both chambers in Brazil. I'll try to speed up. But, given the circumstances I've just mentioned, and also given that the 2023 budget that was approved by Bolsonaro's administration does not foresee the continuity of several basic programs, such as the acquisition of drugs for the popular drugstores. And I believe that Rogério mentioned some issues pertaining to education, but also in the health area, we have lots of constraints. So we have a transition, the beginning of a new mandate. Today it is 28 February, so we have the government in power for 2 months. And when it comes to the transition, and transition meaning when we're going to see the government's position, the way I see this transition will take long and it will be tough. And this is because you need to reconstruct the bureaucratic state, and in a good sense, I'm saying, so that the state can start operating. So it's important to identify priorities, and the government did so. The problem is that everything is priority. Absolutely everything. You know, think of something that has been totally dismantled. And when you dismantle, you have consequences when it comes to maintaining the working conditions, and everything becomes a priority. During these 2 months, the priority was the preservation of life. And for me, this is hugely important. The preservation of life, it was number one priority. And in order to do so, we had the resources for the maintenance of income transfer to the poorest, because when Bolsonaro was in power, he made the approval of some urgency pieces of legislation to transfer cash on an urgent matter basis. So this would end after his mandate. And of course, that it was necessary to guarantee these resources. So Lula is working very hard to obtain a political agreement so that he can ensure this extraordinary budget to pay for these cash transfers. Another aspect that I could mention is the budget that was allocated to very important health and medical surgeries that couldn't be done because the public health was not able to take into account all the surgeries. So the private sector is going to do that, paid by the government. So this is one example of what has been done in order to give priority to life and the continuation of health and medical emergency services in Brazil. Because, you know, you have several surgeries that were urgent and couldn't be carried out due to lack of resources and personnel in the public health system. So this has been guaranteed, as well as the cash transfer to the poorest. So these are some examples that increase the available income. And also you have the Yanomami situation. This is very, very complex. Other than the fight against the gold diggers, it's also important to ban the entrance of the evangelical population in the area, because before the illegal mining, you had the evangelicals that went to the Yanomami protected areas. But going back to my presentation, you had the number one priority being the preservation of life. You have the allocation of resources for this purpose. You have the Yanomami situation. You have the recomposition of the environmental institution, IBAMA, with the new resources, with a new budget allocated to its operation. And in parallel, you have the dismissal of generals and military men who were in power, and this was actually a scandal because it was a civil government we had in theory during Bolsonaro's administration, and you had more military in power in comparison to the military dictatorship. He created several departments. And also Lula appointed women to lots of departments, and this is really unprecedented. Also, Black population, indigenous population, this is all unprecedented. And we also have a woman heading the Ministry of Health in Brazil, and this woman is amazing. And you have women in the high ranks at FUNAI, the Indigenous Institution, public banks, the National Department for the Promotion of the Rights of Peoples is now being headed by a trans woman. And why is it important? It's important. It could be only symbolic, but it's not symbolic. It's concrete, and it's important to signal that the change is taking place. It's ongoing. You know, we don't have we might not have all the resources, we have constraints, but we are already signaling important changes. That's why it was beautiful to have them going, Raoni, the indigenous leader, and all the others going up the ramp together with President Lula, a child, a professor, a worker, the trash collector, and someone else. Anyway, this image was a very important symbol. And this is because during Bolsonaro's administration, we had a fight against indigenous, against the different people, so as to say, trans, Black, even though they are the majority of the Brazilian population. We are different, they're not different. I mean, in any way, this is all part of the transition to signal this in a bold manner, as the government is doing. it's, we had years and years of a macho behavior. And this was not something discreet, something that people would say not loud. This was something that was part of the president's language. The president would say horrible things towards women. It was very present. So, macho behavior, racism, and intolerance in all areas, religious, in terms of thought, so on and so forth. So when you have the black person, the indigenous person indicated to keep positions and the government, we have a signal that the craziness is beginning to end, and it's full of hope of something new. And of course, that we know that erasing these marks of all this is slow turn is difficult because we needed to recover the past. So you needed to erase the past 4 years, the past 6 years, in an attempt to reconstruct the Brazilian society, which it does not mean we had a good society. But in any way, it's a huge challenge. And by confronting this challenge, we are going to be able to construct the necessary steps that are necessary for us to face these issues. And facing these issues is difficult because it's not only about the population or half the population that is against the vaccines. And as you know, we have a population against vaccines in Brazil as well. So this was not, limited to a part of the population. You have the police, the armed forces. We have Bolsonaro supporters in this population. I don't know if I'm being clear here because I don't know. The government is trying to reconstruct and regain its capacity to act and its capacity to put human rights at the source. And by doing so, it is making it possible to construct something new. And such a construction is only possible when you have the participation of the society and an organized society. And in this sense, the government is now recovering the councils that disappeared during Bolsonaro's administration. They are key to the creation of public policy, and these councils are also a bridge with the population that is at the basis. So when you need it, you can activate this population to take to the streets. And now, talking in more economic terms, and then Rogério and Paulo, they can give further details. But in the economic scope, well, it's a problem because I mentioned the increase in the power of the financial capital. And here in Brazil, we have this in the form of the constitutional amendment that set forth the freezing of the public expenditure and independence of the central bank. The central bank has always been independent, but today we can see it is really serving the interests of the financial market. You see the interest rate 13.75% rate. This is outrageous. Well, I don't know if you agree, but the major challenge Lula will have to face from economic perspective is to be able to govern with a fiscal and budget policy that can favor equality, investment, development, and the defense of indigenous people. Because today, the government does not have much power when it comes to fiscal policy. Well, unless when it asks very humbly, so please, could you allow me to spend this or that, We have to see what will be able to be done in this context. I'm very sorry because I know I exceeded my time, but I don't know if I was able to give you an overview. But anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for Rosa, Rogerio, and Paulo presentation. Very excellent. And because we have a time limit, and we select a few of questions, and let's see if you can respond in a simple and precise way. I will read out some questions. I typed it in the chat room. A question for Rogerio. The Bolsonaro government, which had obtained the evangelical support, contradictory embraced the gun culture. How do you analyze this complexity, and how can be overcome the conservative religious influence and the violent culture? And question for Paulo. Faced with the problem of reprimarization of Brazilian economy and public debts has a phenomenon of financialization, and considering that debts are intrinsic to the function of capital, some people propose for reindustrialization and debt cancellation. What is your opinion? And our last two questions for both Rosa and Paulo. The first one, in the first pink tide, Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador largely or partially nationalized the country resources for the benefit of the majority. To what extent can rural government reverse the trend of privatization and nationalize the country resources to bring social welfare to the poor? And the last one, Lula government has promoted for a single Latin American currency. Will it be a revival of the Bank of the South and other leftist leaders promoted many years ago? How can it achieve the effect of de-dollarization? And what is your opinion? Sorry, we have only 10 minutes to left. So could you respond in very simple way?
Acho que eu sou o primeiro a responder, não, Jade?
I believe I'm the first to answer, right, Jade? It seems contradictory, the fact that the population is being armed. And it's important to notice that the number of purchases of weapons by Brazilian citizens has really exploded. It's increased significantly. So the Bolsonaristas, the Bolsonaro supporters, they are armed. They have weapons. And we can find examples almost every day connected to that, especially crimes against women. But we have to be very careful to talk about people's faith, because it's evident, it's obvious, that there are groups, evangelical groups, that are not supporting Bolsonaro, although it is predominant. And this is what myself and Professor Rosa were talking about. We have to understand that the issue of the arms and the evangelical ideology are connected through the ultra-liberalist ideology. An eye for an eye, that's their idea. Entrepreneurship, self-made men, all the ideological operation carried out by some, I mean by some evangelical groups, also having international connections, especially those who are operating in the Amazon, have this ideological feature. And when evangelical factions take space among the poor population, there are liberal ideological apparatuses that are being built. So there's not much contradiction, actually. But it's a very sensitive topic because we're talking here about people's faith. So these are very broad questions. So first, the topic of the debt, the public external debt is not really a problem. The external debt is private. So within the external debt, we have debts that are owned by private companies. There's no way of canceling that debt. It is the capitals themselves. Regarding reindustrialization, Brazil has always found problems to reach high levels of industrialization because of dependency, economical dependency, and also technological dependency. So Brazil has always had the capacity of some technological development. With the globalization of capital, Brazil is still a market that is being more and more restricted. Different from Rosa, I am a pessimist. I'm pessimistic. I believe that Lula's administration will find lots of resistance, and what they can do is offer a little bit of resistance themselves to try to stop barbarism, as they do not really have the tools for intervening massively in the economy. They will be able only to manage some compensatory policies. And the need of the country would be for today is actually of redistributing not only income but also property, for us to be able to recover the family's capacity of purchasing and advancing a process that has been completely derailed over the past 4 years. So it was such a strong backlash, unfortunately, with the support of a very important part of Brazilian electors. As Rosa said, we were talking about the bandits of the government being re-elected as senators, as parliament members. So, talking about Brazil, I don't see many possibilities. Regarding Latin America, and in what was proposed by Chavez and Venezuela, well, the situation has changed a lot. And I see no possibility of a single currency. What is already in place, actually, is a payment system that can be independent from the dollar, but the dollar will be there still as a reference, although the compensations and payments would be done in other currencies. But that is already in place and that is already being used. Latin America is really complicated right now. The Bank of the South has not advanced, and I don't see the conditions, not even the conditions we had in the period of Chavez, in the times of Chavez, Lula, Ecuador, Bolivia, to advance more progressive policy. So this is what I could say very quickly on the questions. Each one of them would deserve more detailed commentaries, but I will stop here. Thank you. First, maybe I didn't speak very well because what I tried to do was show there's so many. I'm sorry. I am not optimistic. I am not pessimistic either. What I think we need actually is a diagnosis of the situation, not to expect things that would be impossible. But what I meant is that capitalism is not being able to keep the pace of their profit. That's why it's so difficult to change. If they will not allow changes such as renationalization, like going back, taking a step back into the privatization process. So regarding Petrobras, maybe we could take some measures, but the most important thing would be to recover the capacity of establishing the prices, regardless of the interests of the shareholders, who have been attaching the prices to an international market. We would need a Petrobras, a national oil company that would have a policy according to the needs of the Brazilian situation. That would be more important than like within Petrobras to go back to a completely nationalized scenario as we had before. That would be too complicated. It's not only about the shares that are being sold, but in the productive chain, some parts of the productive chain have been privatized, so it's very difficult to go back. This topic was really important, Jade, during the first Lula administration, when we have that demand, the political demand of nationalizing Vale do Rio Doce, the national mining company. And I truly believe that the correlation of forces will not allow us to do that. It wouldn't be in the priorities of the administration. Regarding the currency, when Haddad, the minister, talks about a currency, a unified currency, he's talking about currency for trade operations, not anything more than that. I believe we had 10 minutes. That's right, Jade, for everyone to speak. So I'll stop here because we have been talking for over 10 minutes.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, because we have a time limit, and thank you very much. And we will continue our Brazil series, and we also have a hope. Actually, because we believe the hope and power actually come from people, and we would like to play a song to show the beauty of the indigenous people, and also teach us how to teach our children to pay respect to the nature. The name of the song is Pantanal. So thank you very much.